Oh boy, we get to talk about the Sig 320 again. Hooray! Okay. Thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum. And yeah, part 3. Well, my third video on the Sig. Perhaps the last one, we'll see. Obviously, things have changed again for Sig with the death of a U.S. Air Force serviceman from, apparently, a 320 in its holster. Obviously not good. I think it has gotten to the point where Sig is now faced with a problem they cannot solve. They have two problems now. One of them, in theory, they can solve, and that is a hypothetical mechanical problem with the 320 that causes it to fire without someone pulling the trigger or commanding it to fire. Now, I say hypothetical. Let me explain that for a moment before we go farther. If this were a hypothetical criminal case and one had to prove beyond shadow of a doubt or beyond a reasonable doubt that there is a mechanical problem in the 320 that causes it to make fire uncommanded, I don't think at this point you actually can. Hear me out here. First off, there have been dozens of exactly these lawsuits, and only 2 of them have actually come back with Sig being found liable. And in those cases, Sig was not actually found, like there was no actual mechanism determined by the court that resulted in the gun firing. Both of those cases were Sig being found essentially theoretically liable for not having included a trigger safety on the gun. The idea being maybe this wouldn't have happened if there was a trigger safety, which is not the same thing as saying this happened because A caused B caused C and it fired. No one's actually made that case. I think if we look at the strictly theoretical, statistical, world objective view here, there are plausible explanations, like really, really low probability, but existing plausible explanations for basically all of the 320 incidents that have happened, where either there's not enough information known or there is a hypothetical explanation. The problem is, even if Sig tomorrow discovers exactly what the problem was, and I think if they knew at this point, they'd have already fixed it. If they were smart, they'd have announced what it was and announced the fix. And I think the idea that they haven't done that leads to some viable speculation that maybe Sig doesn't know exactly how to fix this and stop it from happening. But even if they do fix it, they have a secondary problem right now that I don't think is surmountable. Like, they can theoretically fix the mechanical problem. What they cannot fix is the reputational issue. Let me point out, people today are still nervous about shooting low serial number 1903 Springfields because of the heat treating that maybe or maybe wasn't done right on them 100 years ago. How's the 320 going to fare over time? Not great, I expect. The fundamental issue here is that the 320 doesn't offer anything different from any of its competitors. When it first came out, the modular fire control unit was, it wasn't technically the first to do it, but it was the only real mainstream option with that modular fire control unit. And that was cool. It gave you the option to have different grip frames that you can just swap out on the same gun, unlike something, like a Glock. Like, you want to change the grip length, buy a new gun. With the 320, hey, well, you can just take the grip frame off and put a different one on. That's cool. It lets you do stocked pistols like the B&T USW 320s. It lets you do Flux Raiders, which are super cool. But today, that's not so much of a unique aspect. A good example would be Springfield Echelon. The HS product Echelon has the exact same modular fire control unit. Now, they haven't done a whole lot with it yet, but frankly, aside from the Flux Raiders, Sig hasn't done a whole lot with that either. The idea of, I can get the medium or the small or the large is kind of, okay, whatever. It's not actually that exciting. But beyond that, it's a 9mm polymer frame striker fired service pistol. And it's kind of cheap. At least it was for the US military, which is one of the biggest reasons that they bought it. Well, today, you want a modular striker fired optics ready 9mm service pistol that's cheap? RX Delta. And it's a great gun. You want a modular fire control, striker fired polymer frame 9mm service pistol that's got better technical elements to it than a 320, Springfield Echelon. The optics mounting on this is cleverer and better, definitely better, than the optics mounting setup on a 320. And it's also a great gun that gives up nothing to the 320 design. If you just want maximum reliability, or you want the ultimate in long-term, durable, excellent optics mounting, and you're not as concerned about being able to swap between every optic on the market, Glock Koa in particular. And it's not going to cost you that much more than a 320 with an optic. In fact, given the prices on the specific 320, the unique 320 specific optic that Sig makes, it's the Romeo something, I don't remember off the top of my head, but a Glock Koa is going to be a lot cheaper than that, and technically better. So this is a fundamental unsolvable problem, I think, for Sig, in that, let's say you're procurement officer Bob and your agency is still carrying Ruger P85s and you've decided they're a little old and they're a little worn out and it's time for something new. What are we going to choose? You don't know what the risk of a 320 is, because again, nobody's actually been able to figure out what the core mechanical issue leading to these problems is, and it leaves open that little tiny chance that maybe there actually isn't one. But if you're looking at this situation, you go, well, I don't know, maybe this is real, seems like it's real, but how, there's how many million of these pistols, how many of them actually are firing uncommanded? Is there some common feature to them that it would be easily avoidable? I don't know. We don't know. What does the Sig 320 offer us that would convince us to buy it despite this element of unknown potential risk? Nothing. That's the problem. You can go get yourself anything from an RX Delta to like staccatos to, which is a little bit of a different class of gun, but Glocks, Walthers, HKs, Springfields or HS products, any number of other guns out there that are going to do exactly the same thing that the 320 does. Now, it is interesting to look at this from the perspective of, say, an armorer for an agency that has already purchased 320s and is trying to decide, do we keep them or do we replace them? Those guys have to make a calculation of what's the risk of keeping them and what's the cost of replacing them. The cost of replacing them is very easy to figure out. It's just some number crunching. Pick the gun, how many guns you need, done. Calculating the risk is the impossible thing right now, because you just don't know. Like, there is no data. No one can tell you what percentage of 320s have a flaw that will cause them to fire uncommanded. So how do you make that decision as an armor? I don't know. Like, you kind of can't. Not a pleasant place to be in. I do not envy any of those guys their decisions. Anyway, and making that decision is kind of beside the point. People have to do that with their own, on their own judgment. I think it is also interesting to look at this from the perspective of a competitor pistol company who goes, wow, I'm sure glad we're not in that situation. Let's go to the drawing board and let's make some notes to make sure we're never in that situation. And I think it is worth looking at two specific things that Sig did with the 320 that I think contributed to getting them where they are now. See, the thing is, I talked about this previously discussing Sig, there are actually three separate problems with the 320. Two of them absolutely 100% provable. The third one is still, the jury's out, literally and figuratively. Problem number one was the drop safety. There was a legit drop safety problem with the original 320s, and it's entirely Sig's fault. They should have been more careful. That's like, it's not like surprise drop safety. What? We didn't even think about drop safety. No, they should have been more careful. And when the guns proved to have a drop safety fault, they didn't recall them, presumably because that would have been super expensive even at that point. They offered a voluntary upgrade, which a lot of people didn't get because they're like, oh, my gun doesn't need it. It's fine. It's voluntary. That means it's not that important. Well, it potentially is important. Depends what your standard of safety level is. Had that not happened, like because that happened, Sig got into people's heads as, oh, that's the gun that fires if you drop it. And it was true, I mean, within the limitations of the actual mechanical flaws of the drop safety. But if they hadn't had that, Like, that's the gun not loaded for the next couple of issues to happen. The second issue is SIG did not put a trigger safety on the 320. Do you technically need it? No. And I think not having any actual insight into SIG's development, marketing, decision-making process, it feels to me like they were very deliberate and left the trigger safety off as a way to differentiate themselves from the competition. Like, our triggers have a better press, they have a better feel, they don't have this little dingus hanging off the middle of the trigger because you don't need it, because we have all these other safety mechanisms, and that's why we're better. When in reality, I like that trigger safety, at least for me, the dingus in a Glock or like all of the other pistols on the market, that doesn't actually cause any real problem. It's not an issue with the trigger pull. And it very much does prevent accidental discharges with holsters. If your holster's kind of wonky, if you get your shirt caught when you're holstering the pistol, that's absolutely a thing that can happen and that does happen, and that a trigger safety will often prevent from turning into a fired gun. And SIG doesn't have a trigger safety. And so I don't know how many of their unintended discharge incidents are the result of something catching on the trigger and unintentionally pulling it. But I feel pretty safe assuming it's greater than 0%. And so if they had a trigger safety on the gun, it would have prevented some percentage of these issues. And then, like, that's the problem that was loaded by the drop safety, and then it was cocked by the lack of trigger safety and the issues that inevitably came from that. And then, assuming that there is a mechanical fault in this pistol that causes it to fire uncommanded, which it sure looks like. You know, if you're SIG's PR department, it doesn't matter if there is or not. You just, like, the world thinks there is now, so that's what you'd better go with. And that's the unintended discharge in the PR sense on SIG. And had they not done the previous two mistakes, they would at least be in a better position. It's, to my mind, like, it's entirely hypothetically possible that the uncommanded discharge is a literal 1 in a million thing. And if people hadn't already been looking at SIG and expecting problems from those first two issues, maybe even if this was a legit mechanical problem, it would have been rare enough that it would not have gotten attention. That still means it's bad. That still means it shouldn't have been in the gun's design, but it wouldn't have been a problem for SIG. So if you're another gun company looking at this situation, I think one of the lessons to take away from it is you need to take safety seriously enough that you address it in positions where, you know, do we really need to is this enough of a safety issue that we really need to do it? Maybe make sure that you've pushed that decision boundary pretty darn close to, yes, we should always do something in favor of more safety in the design. So that'd be the takeaway for me there. As for SIG, like, what are SIG's options at this point? That's another intellectually very interesting question. I think there's a reasonable chance they don't know what the actual problem is with the 320. Now, and you guys are already saying it, and I can tell, like, oh, the problem is they cheaped out and its quality control is bad. Well, fine, that may very well be the case, but that doesn't let you solve the problem. Like, to solve the problem, you need to know what the actual specific mechanical thing is that happened. And then you can redesign some part or change a quality control spec or something to prevent it from happening again. Just saying, oh, they got cheap, fine, maybe they did, but that doesn't solve the problem. So, like, that doesn't do SIG any good to try and fix it with. If there is a mechanical problem that is identified specifically, does that force them to do a recall? Maybe, I don't know. Could SIG survive recalling all the 320s that are out there? I don't know, maybe, maybe not. What do they do as a company? Like, if you just assume that this is a tainted product, which seems to be a pretty safe assumption, regardless of, like, that's a problem independent of the mechanics of the gun. That is, in the public's view, a tainted product now. So what do you do with it? Well, I think looking at the other guns that SIG has available, I think their best option would be to expand the P365 in scope and scale this thing out of production and replace it. You know, they've got the 365 macro, come up with like the 365 service issue size. The P365 is a fundamentally different mechanism than the 320. The 320 is a development off the P250, and that's probably where some of its problems originate from, if not all of them. Adapting the 250 design into this, instead of going with a series of mechanical features that are really known to be safe and really well proven and used by everybody everywhere, which is what the 365 did. So if I were hypothetically SIG, boy, I'm glad I'm not, that's probably where I would look, is expanding the 365, taking that out of production, because it's hosed. Like, honestly, if you don't know what the problem is at this point, just don't even bother to keep looking, because it's a dead product anyway, regardless. Even if you fix it, they're like, it's been 100 years. There's still people who are sketchy about shooting a 1903 Springfield because some of them weren't quite heat treated right 100 years ago. I don't know where you go if you're SIG.